Alright, welcome back to Doom 2. So here is where the beast finally unmasks itself and we see the true form of Doom 2, and it is blander than many would like. I think this is the point in the game where a lot of people... For me, it was the pit, I think. The pit is where I kind of realized, okay, where is this actually really going? Because it felt like it was going somewhere until it didn't. But I think for a lot of people, the game sort of builds up that you're going to go into the city, and the title is really, it's Hell on Earth. So this episode that begins here with map 12, The Factory, which is by Sandy Peterson, by the way, is this is where it's, this is where you're in the sort of the grip of the city, and it's a city that's in flames and on fire. And yet when you play these maps, oftentimes it just feels like a bunch of slabs of buildings that you kind of randomly walk into and walk out of. It doesn't have any real sense of like flow, but even like spatial continuity. It feels like a city in the most literal sense, and if there's one thing that Doom shouldn't be, it's literal. At least, if we're comparing it to the Doom of Doom 1, or even the first episode of Doom 2. So I think that's one of the biggest crimes of these levels. The next two levels are both going to be by Sandy Peterson, and if you sort of rule out the problems, like rule out how it must have felt to play this game, and really feel like they were going to do something really cool or interesting or different with this city setting, sort of make it really feel like it's being taken over by hell, even make it feel like Mount Erebus, which is the map that this and Downtown, the next map, were probably inspired by from Doom 1, which is also by Sandy Peterson. Also an open-ended map, but much more creatively textured. It feels much more like hell, and it's also very unexpected because you don't really go outside in another map like that to that degree in Doom 1. But here, it's exactly what's expected, and because it's exactly what's expected, it just feels kind of obligatory. And if you look at the actual encounters that are happening in these spaces, it's not too bad. Like, there are definitely creative uses of space, and Sandy Peterson gets something out of all of these, like, little encounters in a way that, like, it could have been... it could have been empty rooms, it could have been much more abysmal. It would have been a huge step down instead of just a step down in terms of design. If it were that would have been extremely depressing for any, game company of that time to do. But it's like obvious that their standards were not as high for these maps, that they didn't really have a lot of oversight, and that I'm not really sure if Sandy Peterson had any business making these maps. And I say that as like, I think like he gets maligned oftentimes. And I think in the case of maybe the next two maps, in some ways definitely rightly so, but in other ways he made a bunch of really interesting maps. And later in the episode, the second half of this sort of mini episode, starting from map 15, although I don't like map 16 at all, which is also by Sandy Peterson, and some people do. But starting then, I think the episode gets really cool, actually, and there are a bunch of pretty creative maps. And coming back to Doom 2, I have a different perception of what this is, because Doom 1 and 2 just seem like this, like, especially 2, it just seems like this kind of goofy thing that, like, Doom 1 was almost made by this kind of unstable series of factors that held things together, and it was only a matter of time before it sort of came apart. But at the very least, Doom 2 manages to feel fun and kind of all over the place in a way that's interesting, even though it's not cohesive and even though it is a step down. I think this area in the factory, I think this was one of my least favorite maps in Doom, in the entirety of Doom, when Doom 2, when I first played it. But coming back to it, I appreciate, one, that there's this like central area here, and this is a big part of the map. And there's this very strange use of keys here. I do like this texture that's being used. This like blown out brown texture is kind of interesting. But this is mostly flat here. And then there's one key here. And then there's another key just on the other side of this hallway. And it feels very arbitrary. It's kind of fascinating. I think there is one map that he has a better creative use of that, like randomly placing keys places, like putting a key right there where there's just one guy. It's just a dead-end hallway, and an essential key is right there, right on the other side of a hallway from a yellow key. Is very strange. And maybe that goes with the idea that like hell is this arbitrary thing. And I think that's what's kind of makes it interesting, that you can even talk about it in that way, that there is this kind of like fun wackiness of like, what the hell is going on? I like this room. I like it whenever, you know, it's a very basic thing that you can do with Doom geometry, but I like this. It reminds me of an area in Doom 1 Episode 2 Map 3 that has like lifts going up and down like that. But I don't really get where the factory thing is. I feel like the names were almost applied retroactively. Like, if you really want to see these maps be realized, or these themes be realized to their full potential, there are so many Doom megawads that kind of that came out afterwards that do these city settings and do it in a more kind of substantial and you know, more fully realized way, and aren't these just like weird slabby blocks of spaces where you go from one building to the next, and there isn't like any sort of sense of like flow or continuity or something between them. But at least this area looks kind of like, I don't know, it's kind of interesting. I like this little trap here. It's unexpected. You don't really know. I guess the one thing I would say for all of the Sandy Petersen maps pretty much is, even when the architecture of the maps, like the outside especially areas, feel uninspired, you still never really know what to expect from a particular map. And I think that's like, there are a lot of games that are just, they just get by on like, you know, like cinematics and like having, I don't know, like they just get by on gimmicks rather than trying to do something interesting with the actual design of the spaces. I feel like a lot of more modern games kind of post like 2000, spaces got more realistic and drab and blah, and they kind of relied on other things to make experiences interesting. I mean, this room is interesting also, even though he stole it completely from Tom Hall's idea in Episode 2, Map 2. Tom Hall does the exact same thing in order to pick up a key. But hey, like at least he's stealing an idea that is kind of neat, you know, kind of neat and interesting. There's a, like, sort of a Mario game or something. There's a sense that each space kind of has its own little identity that you can wander into. It's this like nice little sandbox. That's the thing I like about Super Mario 64, is you can kind of wander in. Of course, that game is more freewheeling and like, you know, you can go in and out, and you don't have to like go through all the level, and there isn't like the threat of death isn't as scary as it is in like Doom 2, but there is that general sense of like kind of like anarchy in the way the experience is designed, and that's definitely not something that was carried over into map design past the 90s, I would say. And that's the thing that I miss. You know, I've said this many times. Actually, think her name is Terrorist, like wrote an article recently about Doom, like the new Doom and Doom's engine. But specifically, one of the points that was brought up, which is something that I've always thought about too, like, why is it so normal in the game industry for us to be okay with the fact that, like, you can not have anyone who worked on an original game, who came up with that idea, who did anything to make that game interesting. It's just a complete sequel by somebody different, and you can still call it that, like, and still pretend like the original development team have no rights, they don't exist, they don't have any access to, you know, they don't have any input on the game, and act like it's still part of the same series, like it's still part of the same thing. If it's completely different people making the work, why should it even be considered the same thing? And I'm not even saying that to like insult the new Doom. I think there's like 1 or 2 people who worked on the original Doom who worked on, like, Kevin Cloud. I mean, Kevin Cloud is not somebody who had like a huge say over this game. Not saying that like his contributions weren't important or whatever, but, you know, compared to Carmack or Romero or Sandy Peterson or Adrian Carmack too. So that's the thing, like, I don't think that's really fair. I don't know. But apparently in the game industry, like, the creators don't really have as much of an identity, or it's just kind of okay. People see companies or whatever as these inherent entities. Maybe there's this like internalized cynicism. I'm not sure exactly. By the way, this is a trap. If you go in here, this is a room that, like, if you go in from the beginning, it's the most obvious room to go in from when you start the map, and it's just a bunch of imps. There's nothing much here. That's why I saved going into it for later and, you know, used the BFG, so it wasn't a problem at all. But especially if you're starting from pistol, that kind of trap is not great. It's one of those things that, like, also, I entered the main area, the central area, through that like side area, which is another big feature of like these sandy maps, that you can enter big areas from the side or like teleport from somewhere else and get to places that you weren't before. And this part right here is also a point of no return, which is interesting, and I find out later. So there are a lot of interesting features here. I actually do like this exit area with the cacodemons and the lifts going up and down. I always associated with this with a different map. I always, for some reason, thought that this was in the waste tunnels, which just goes to show you that, like, a lot of sections of these maps individually have interesting things going on in them, but they almost feel distinct from, like, the map itself. The map itself doesn't really have an identity. I mean, if we're really, like, speaking of versions of these maps that are, you know, done by modders that are worth playing, there's the set, which I've mentioned several times before, Doom the Way It Did, and there's also Doom 2 the Way It Did, and there's basically a version of the Factory by Essel, and it's also a pretty small map, but I think is like a lot more compact and interesting than this map is. I mean, Essel has the benefit of 25 years of, however many years it is, God, I don't remember, of hindsight, but it'll be the same with the next map that's coming up. One of my favorite city-inspired maps was also in Doom 2 the Way It Did by Alfonso, and I actually did a video for the Doom mixtape series that I did about that. So anyway, definitely check that out and check those maps out. So people in the Doom community, I think, really want to make these, really want the chance to make these city maps feel more interesting and feel more sort of like they accomplish something, even though, you know, there are definitely interesting elements to them, as you can see in this sort of exit area and so many of the kind of side areas. They have an interesting character, they just don't quite come together. And some of the crazy texturing and wackier stuff, I think, works to Sandy Peterson's advantage, actually, than when he's trying to do a realistic environment that is literally just ends up being slabs. he benefits from doing crazier environments because his maps really are just one thing to another. But then again, he has some maps that are much more cohesive in terms of theme, like Unholy Cathedral and Doom 1, that you wonder why they're not carried over here. But for better or for worse, this is Doom 2. The factory is what Doom 2 is, and it's going to be the next few maps. And it's actually interesting to think about how the city maps actually don't comprise much of Doom 2. These two are probably... Well, I'd say the factory isn't very memorable, but this is probably the one city map that everyone remembers downtown. And it literally is just... This is the most literal map that you can think of. It is just downtown. Like, it is a bunch of tall buildings. You go from building to building. There are different ways to enter the buildings, and there's actually like a little hub, but it really is just like, it's flat. You walk, and there's different like sections contained in different buildings. It's as literal an interpretation of downtown as you could possibly imagine. And, you know, I think in retrospect, it's easier to appreciate some of the unique things that he does from the moment-to-moment encounters, but it's very frustrating if you're expecting something that feels more polished or like more inspired in terms of the overall big picture. This is definitely not it. There is an interesting arrow pointing you exactly where to go, which is kind of hilarious because it shows, like, you know, someone like Romero is so concerned with direction and directing the player in the right place and, you know, all of this, and Sandy Peterson is just putting a giant arrow using tricks that they use now in AAA games to kind of deal with the fact that your environments are too complicated and you don't know how to design something to direct someone to a particular place, so you just slap a giant fucking arrow on it. I mean, it's kind of funny. Like, that arrow is like probably the thing that I remembered the most about this map. Just like, but like the logic of Doom often makes me think that like, oh, I shouldn't go there or something, because it, you know, oftentimes it tricks you. Of course, no, it's not tricking you here. It literally is. That arrow is instructing you to go here because this is the most important room or section in the level to go to, because it ends up putting you in a tiny little hub part that you can get to that you need to get to several sections from. So I guess one of the interesting features about this map is that the fact that you have to, like, you can't just go up to the buildings and enter them. Like, you have to warp from somewhere else. Like, and that's again what I was saying about the moment-to-moment design being actually kind of interesting. By the way, I said there aren't very many cargo areas in Doom 2 in an earlier video, and obviously I was misremembering that there's at least a few of them in these, like, city maps. But anyway, like, on a moment-to-moment level, like, at least he found an interesting way for you to go from one space to another. I think that, like, there's so many maps afterwards that have improved on this and done it better, like, in so many different ways, that I almost forgot. I completely forgot this map because there's so many, like, Doom 2 downtown inspired maps that are, like, trying to do their own version of it, that I just couldn't remember what was actually in this map because I never play it. This is like a map that I never want to play. It's not like one that I find particularly fun to navigate. I actually died quite a bit, partly because I was confused and partly just because, like, I just wasn't, like, you know, I think it's more just disorienting than anything else. I don't think this... you sort of feel like in the John Romero maps, you sort of feel like the designer, even when they're hard, you feel like the designer is directing you in some way, and like they do give a fuck about you as a player. But in the Sandy Peterson maps, like, he doesn't give a fuck. This is the city of, like, DGAF. This is the city of don't give a fuck. Like, there's no like, I guess he gives enough of a fuck to put an arrow, and there are bonuses, but like, it feels like his maps feel very cold sometimes, like they feel very indifferent to the player, which is actually kind of an interesting thing when you think about it. And it makes it, that approach, like, the fact that you can even perceive, like, there is a perceivable approach to the map kind of distinguishes it from, I'd say, a lot of, like, you know, more contemporary first-person shooters where it's hallway to hallway, etc. I mean, yeah, it depends on what you're talking about, which game that you're talking about. But, like, the fact that you can even perceive that is kind of interesting. It makes it an interesting piece of art, I guess you could say. But it's a real, like, it doesn't give you any sense of, like, that's how things are, and, like, it doesn't direct you, and really, and it just feels weird and random, and, like, it doesn't really feel like the game actually prepares you for that, or, you know, puts things in the environment that will signal that you're supposed to expect that to some degree. It just throws you in this, like, slabby environment, and then you kind of feel like you're expected to know where to go, and then when you don't, it just feels a little strange and disorienting, and it doesn't even do enough with that kind of feeling for you to feel like that's really taken advantage of to any full degree. So it's not even that it's alienating and confusing, because that in itself is interesting. But also, or that, like, this key, right, that you pick up by all these, like, teleporters here that send you to different parts of the map so that you have to keep returning here. That's really interesting, actually. That's an interesting setup. It makes this map more kind of fun, or it makes it more surprising to play, I guess. But it's more that, like, that isn't reflected by some of the other elements in the map. Like, he didn't go fully into being weird. He just sort of, it's like a bunch of different approaches that aren't fully quite realized. It's not that his maps are weird that is the problem, is basically what I'm saying. I want to get that out, because when I'm talking about the thing that I was saying before about the sequels to these games, they're not by the same team. So what is the core, like, identity? Why is it even the same game? Why do we even consider it the same game? Why is it part of the same series, you know? And I think Doom 2016 did, like, a lot of effort to try and comment on the original game, partly because of just the fan base of Doom and everything like that. But, like, it's still, I mean, it's still a fundamentally different game, even though people want to think that it isn't. And I think that's the issue that I have. Why don't these designers have more voice and more respect in terms of, why don't we give them more of sort of accolades, or more, even when, or not even accolades, maybe we don't like what they did. Just give them more credit for defining the feel of the game, even if you don't like it. Like, give them more credit for actually defining the experience and seeing that as a product of them and their design. I mean, it's a very auteur thing, but in this case, like, it applies because each level is done by one person. It really is. Like, this is an author. It's like reading a short story or something by an author. Like, inevitably, and there isn't a lot of oversight by other people, so inevitably this really is the vision, the idea of one person when you're playing an individual map. So you really can see their individual sensibilities. And those individual sensibilities and personalities are so important to defining this game and, like, the id Software in general. So, like, when you take that out of the equation, what do you have left? It's not even the same thing anymore. That's the problem that I have. Why isn't that considered such a crucial part of the experience? And I think, like, with, like, the modding scene, if you're talking about that, like, people definitely are continuing that same approach, and they do consider that part of the experience. But like oftentimes for a casual player or whatever, why is that not like, why? I don't know. I think certain people say auteur theory doesn't apply to video games because too many people work on it, but I think it's the same with film. Like a lot of people work on film, and I think like, you know, saying that like one game is entirely defined by, you know, one lead designer or something is maybe not the best way to go. But like there's no question that like individual designers like shaped what this experience is. Yeah, by the way, there's that plasma. I like that little plasma rifle that you run in there, and there's a crushing ceiling if you don't get it fast enough. Yeah, these areas on the side, like I think he does it best to try and make them interesting. So when you explore like the side nooks or whatever, and there's this teleporter on the far end of the level, so if you immediately like run to that, it'll at least put you somewhere that you can, you know, so at least it feels like you're making some progress. So that's something. It isn't just trapping you at a dead end. You can go through that teleporter, so that isn't too bad. But yeah, I just don't understand why is this not an important part of the experience? Why is it even the same game if it's by different people and just using the same franchise name? I just don't understand that. I feel like it's unfair. Like I felt like it was unfair that Tom Hall wasn't credited, you know, for years in this game, and the only reason that anyone cares now is because of like Romero just has great memory, remembers these things, and like, you know, went to efforts to like make sure that his friend like actually got credit for helping shape the game. And like, and also it's a really popular game. There's probably so many games that like people made substantial contributions for that they're not even credited for, or even if they are, like no one cares about the credits unless they're like a game industry insider. And I feel like that's something that needs to change. And that was one of the reasons why I was like, you know, why a big proponent of like indie stuff, because it is just about an author, or a lot of that stuff when it's by about a smaller number of people, it is about like an author or a small series of authors, so that you can feel like, you know, the vision or ideas of like 4 people or something, or 3 people or 2 people, as opposed to, you know, a giant committee of people. Because once things start to get too big, if they're not directed enough, then it really is just you're doing this design by committee, which some people think is a good idea, but I think is a terrible idea for making anything but like, if you're making like, for making anything but products, like if you're making giant buildings and you're designing from a template, design by committee is great. Design by committee is great for designing in a template, but do you want your fucking game to be a template? Like, do you want this experience to be a template? There's nothing that feels template about this. There's like absolutely nothing about this game that feels like it's from a template. It feels so weird. Even as it kind of inspired, created the genre of first-person shooters, this game is so weird. These maps are so weird. Even as like it's uninspired, it's still weird. It's still unique, you know. Even at its most like uninspired. That's what I find so frustrating. I don't know. It feels like things changed so quickly and people forget. And I don't know, like, and people get angry if you even like bring up the fact that like, you know, individual designers shape this, and like this isn't how things are anymore. Like this is what you actually care, like what you care about in games is by the way, I like that guy was stuck in the wall. But yeah, what you care about in games is the voice of individual creators almost all the time, saying like, let's do something that is different, like let's do something that is a nice trap, by the way. Let's do something that you know, pushing for something that isn't like immediately marketable in that one time, isn't the thing that like is the thing that everyone else is doing, because certainly everyone else wasn't doing this game. I mean, Wolfenstein was popular, but like no one else was making a game like this. They completely defined like the genre and feeling of this game completely from like the ground up, and like that's another thing that I value about it. Even though it's like seen as this first person shooter that is like, it's such an obvious thing now. People see it as being this like obvious thing now. That was something that somebody had to invent, and they invented it, and like that takes a lot of balls and like a lot of cleverness that a lot of other people are not willing to do. So like so how is that different from, you know, like an indie game designer, somebody who's trying to like invent a new kind of sense of how you kind of a new kind of experience, or how you play a game or something like that? People just take for granted that somebody took a chance and like actually did something different. And I think it's people see it as okay in the case of Doom or like Mario or something, because they were like validated by the market. Like, you know, the market said that these games were massively popular, so a lot of people obviously wanted them. But that's such a rare like occurrence. There are a lot of people who invented a lot of interesting things that didn't sell massive amounts of copies, that maybe we can appreciate now, or maybe are still not even appreciated now. And they just happen to not be lucky to be in the right place at the right time, to not be on this like technological cutting edge that like id Software was on, to not be in the right place at the right time, you know, and or just to not, you know, have the right kind of features to make this thing into like an interesting experience. Because there's so many like games that, you know, people would consider, you know, being defining or something at the time, but like if you look back, they don't. There's something about the experience that just doesn't hold up very well. But at the meantime, like when you revisit Doom, like there is something that is still kind of immediately accessible about the experience that doesn't feel like, if you compare it to like, you know, modern first-person shooters, maybe it feels weird because it's different, but it like in the context of like, you know, indie games and so many things like that, there's still a lot of stuff that carries over here, you know, that someone came up with 20 years ago. I don't know. I'm sorry going a rant about this. No, I'm honestly not sorry for going on a rant about this, but like, it just, that's the whole point of like doing this, it's just not, it's not like, it's something that's made by human beings, and I don't think that people understand that. Or like, by the way, that was a wall glide. That's a bug in the game. You can do that. That was totally accidental, but like speedrunners will use that a lot. I should also mention that this is actually an older version. This is like 1.66 or something. And the version that most people play is Doom 1.9. I think that was the final version. I don't know what changes were made, but this is literally just the Doom 2 like WAD file that I've had for ages, so that's the reason why it's, you know, maybe there are a few things that are different from what you're used to seeing. But anyway, it just like, I just don't get it. I don't get like how when people asked me, you know, like, are you excited for the new Doom? Like I did finally play Doom 2016, and I thought it was a fun game, but it's still not the same thing. Like, it's still a totally different experience. Is that a bad thing? Like, no, but it's by different people, you know, it's a totally different era, it's a totally different sort of set of, it just like, I feel like we have to respect like the creators somewhat, and they don't have like a lot of agency in a lot of these things. It's the same thing with like all those like new Wolfenstein games. They're probably perfectly good, perfectly fine, but like I grew up with Wolfenstein 3D, and it's just a completely different sort of game. It's a completely different people. The feeling, the things that I liked about that game were completely different from anything that, you know, even like at the time when I played Return to Castle Wolfenstein, which many people, you know, consider sort of the equivalent of like Doom 2016, and then it does try and echo some of the structure of like Wolfenstein's missions. But even at the time I was like, this is a completely different game. I don't like this because it's a different game. And, you know, I can look back now and be like, okay, it's a different game. I can play this now. But, like, then why is it using that name, you know? Okay, so here's a key area that I think does a lot with just this, like, brutalist architecture and the very small amount of space that it's actually allotted to, like, make an interesting encounter. And I think that's the kind of the distinguishing factor, like what makes a lot of these Sandy Petersen maps still reasonably fun to play, is that, like, even if you're going in these slabby buildings, like inside, there's something creative done with the way that you're gonna, like, approach the encounter. Yeah, I don't know. It's frustrating to me. I think that's why I'm like, trying to get people to think about, like, designers and stuff. And I don't know. It's just like, I feel like, I don't want to, like, be a broken record here, but I feel like a lot changed in the industry towards a direction of things that I just had trouble identifying with in the same way that I did when I first got into video games. And I feel like it happened around the turn of the century. And certainly there were some changes. Like, certainly there's some good things about, you know, games that came out after, I don't know, 2002 or 2003 or whatever. But I'd say it's even later than that is really the games that I start to have issues with, like 2005 or 2006 on. But I don't know. I feel like we lost something, and, like, it hasn't really ever come back. And the only way that it's been preserved at all is through these, like, modding communities and stuff like that. Which oftentimes, I mean, the Doom modding community is quite big, so it does get credit. And it has its own sort of built-in audience, but, like, that's not always the case. And it's still not seen as, like, as serious or important a contribution, you know, as somebody making a commercial game. It's considered a hobbyist thing, which, you know, maybe rightfully so a lot of the time. But I don't know, it just doesn't feel... I feel like a lot of people don't get credit that they deserve for this stuff. By the way, I like that the exit is you just walking into a pit of lava, like a tiny vat of lava. I missed a lot of secrets in this map. I tried to, like, look some up, but I tried to find some on my own. But yeah, that's downtown. You get a sense of what that map is. Definitely check out those maps that I mentioned earlier from Doom 2 the way it did. There's a bunch of sets that try and do this, like, city map, downtown sandbox style and improve upon, you know, some of the weaknesses of these past two maps. But coming up, I think, is where the episode 2 starts to really improve and branch out and try different things. So definitely stay tuned for that. Thank you for watching.